The air in Elysian was not merely air, it was a curated atmosphere, a meticulously crafted silence that money bought and power maintained. It smelled of ancient wealth, a subtle blend of leather from $100,000 briefcases, expensive French perfume that clung to the air like a ghost, and the earthy, decadent aroma of black truffles being shaved over a plate miles away in the kitchen. The sounds were muted, reverent, as if the cavernous dining room were a cathedral dedicated to commerce. The distant, delicate clinking of silver against porcelain, the whisper-soft murmur of conversations where fortunes were made or broken, and the silent, gliding steps of the staff across the polished marble floors. Above, colossal crystal chandeliers hung like frozen constellations, their light refracted into 1,000 tiny rainbows that danced on the surfaces of flawlessly polished wine glasses. Each table was an island, a private kingdom separated by vast oceans of empty space, ensuring that the secrets whispered here remained sacrosanct. This was not a restaurant. It was a sanctuary for the titans of the world, a gilded cage where the 1% came to feast, and the staff were trained to be nothing more than the ghosts who served them. Within this theater of opulence, Anya Tanaka moved with a grace born of relentless discipline. To the patrons, she was a part of the decor, a fleeting shape in a crisp black uniform, her presence registered only by the silent refilling of a water glass, or the unobtrusive placement of a dish. Her movements were economical, precise, each step and gesture honed over hundreds of nights spent serving the city's elite. But beneath this veneer of professional invisibility, a universe of thought and memory churned. Her mind, a place that once dissected complex legal precedents and debated the nuances of international corporate law at Columbia, was now occupied with the timing of entrees and the specific temperature preferences for sparkling water. The starched collar of her uniform felt like a yoke, a constant, physical reminder of the life that had been stolen from her. Her heart, which should have been racing with the thrill of a courtroom battle, beat a slow, steady rhythm of controlled endurance. She was a ghost, yes, but she was a ghost with a purpose, a specter haunting the halls of the very class of people who had shattered her world. Every perfectly folded napkin, every polished wine glass, was a small act of devotion to a man lying in a sterile room miles away. The image of her grandfather, Kenji Tanaka, was the fuel that burned within her, a constant, aching presence. She remembered him not as the frail, silent figure in the nursing home bed, but as the titan he once was. She saw him in their family dojo, his voice strong and resonant as he taught her the intricate strokes of classical Japanese calligraphy, explaining how each character held a story of honor and duty. He was the one who insisted she master the language of their ancestors, not the simplified tongue of modern business, but the formal, poetic language of law and literature. He called it the language of the soul. Now the memory was a double-edged sword. It was the source of her strength and the measure of her loss. The hostile takeover of Tanaka Innovations, orchestrated by a predator she knew only by name, had not just stolen their wealth. It had stolen her grandfather's voice, his vitality, his very essence, leaving behind a shell that the doctor said required round-the-clock care costing over $15,000 a month. That number was branded into her mind. It was the reason she endured the condescending glances and the invisible servitude of Elysian. Every dollar she earned was a small piece of justice, a tiny rebellion against the forces that had broken him. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. The delicate equilibrium of the dining room shifted the moment Gideon Blackwood arrived. It was not a loud entrance, but a palpable one, like a drop in barometric pressure that signals an approaching storm. The air itself seemed to part for him as he strode through the entrance, the maître d', bowing with the deference reserved for royalty. Blackwood was a man sculpted from arrogance and expensive tailoring. His suit was a dark bespoke armor, his silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his face held a permanent expression of bored superiority. He didn't walk, he conquered space, his presence sucking the ambient warmth from his surroundings. He moved with the unshakable certainty of a man who had never been told no, a man who viewed the world not as a community of people, but as a collection of assets to be acquired and liquidated. To him, every person was either a tool, an obstacle, or utterly irrelevant. The staff of Elysian, including Anya, fell squarely into the third category. He was the CEO of Blackwood Capital, a name that was a curse in the Tanaka household, a name synonymous with ruin. Anya felt a familiar coldness seep into her stomach as he was seated in her section, accompanied by a distinguished-looking Japanese man in his late 60s. She recognized the archetype immediately, a potential investor to be courted, impressed, and ultimately devoured. She approached the table, her face a mask of professional neutrality, the water pitcher in her hand feeling impossibly heavy. Blackwood did not acknowledge her existence. He didn't even lift his eyes from the menu as she filled his glass. He spoke to his guest in a loud, performative tone, his voice booming with the false bonhomie of a predator trying to appear tame. He gestured expansively, pontificating on market trends and global finance, dropping names and figures with a casualness designed to overwhelm. The Japanese investor, in stark contrast, was a portrait of quiet dignity. He listened patiently, his eyes missing nothing, his posture exuding a calm authority that made Blackwood's bluster seem all the more crude and desperate. Anya moved away from the table, her back rigid. She knew this man only by reputation, as the architect of her family's downfall, but seeing him in person, witnessing the sheer force of his dismissive pride, made the injustice feel fresh, raw, and deeply personal. The main courses had been cleared, and the conversation had lulled. It was then that Blackwood, in a grand gesture of performative worldliness, reached into his expensive leather briefcase. He produced a document, a scroll of thick, creamy washi paper covered in elegant, flowing Japanese calligraphy. He unrolled it across the table with a flourish, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. It was a beautiful object, a piece of art in its own right, the black ink, a stark, dramatic contrast against the paper. He presented it to his guest not with respect, but as a trophy, a spoil of war. He tapped a finger on the paper, his touch a desecration of the elegant script. He was speaking in English, his voice laced with the condescending tone of a man explaining a complex concept to a simple child, even though his guest was a native of the culture he was butchering with his explanation. He was attempting to show off his latest acquisition, a final piece of a puzzle that solidified his control over a new international venture, a testament to his global reach and his power to bend any system to his will. He leaned back in his chair, basking in the presumed admiration of his guest. The Japanese investor studied the document with a polite, unreadable expression. Blackwood, mistaking silence for awe, continued his performance. He waved a dismissive hand over the beautiful, complex characters. "The artistry is impressive, of course," he boomed, his voice echoing slightly in the hushed room. "But the language is just a formality. A lot of poetic nonsense about honor and legacy, you know how they are. All that really matters is the signature at the bottom. That's the part that's worth $1 billion. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. It was at that moment, as Anya approached to refill his water glass for the third time, that his gaze fell upon her. A cruel, amused glint entered his eyes. He saw her uniform, her quiet deference, her invisibility. He saw a prop for his next display of superiority. With a smirk directed at his guest, he gestured vaguely toward Anya and the document. "I doubt our waitress," he said, the words dripping with contempt, "could even tell which way is up on a thing like this." The world stopped. The hushed murmur of the restaurant, the distant clinking of silver, the very air in Anya's lungs, it all froze. The insult, so casual, so thoughtless, struck her with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a slight against her intelligence. It was a desecration of her entire world, of her grandfather's soul, In that instant, the image of Kenji Tanaka filled her mind. Not frail in his bed, but strong and proud, his hand guiding hers as they practiced calligraphy, his voice explaining the profound meaning behind the very characters Blackwood had just dismissed as poetic nonsense. The phrase he mocked, honor and legacy, was the very core of her grandfather's being. A glacial fury, cold and solid, began to crystallize in her veins. Her heart, which had been a dull, aching drum, now beat with a slow, powerful, and dangerous rhythm. Her breath, which she feared might catch in her throat, became steady and controlled. The years of repressed grief, of silent struggle, and swallowed pride coalesced into a single point of absolute, unshakable clarity. She slowly, deliberately placed the heavy glass water pitcher on the table. The sound it made against the fine linen was not loud, but it was definitive. It was the sound of a ghost deciding to become solid. It was the sound of the end of her silence. The heavy glass pitcher landed on the fine linen tablecloth with a soft, definitive thud that seemed to absorb all the sound in the cavernous dining room. It was a period at the end of a sentence she had not yet spoken, a declaration that the era of her invisibility was over. For a heartbeat, the world remained suspended in the amber light of the chandeliers, a perfect tableau of power and servitude. But then Anya lifted her head, and the illusion shattered. The deferential softness in her eyes was gone, replaced by a crystalline hardness, the look of a judge gazing down from the bench. Her posture, once a study in self-effacing service, straightened with an authority that seemed to add inches to her height. The air around her crackled with a sudden, intense pressure, and Gideon Blackwood, for the first time in what was likely decades, felt the unfamiliar and deeply unsettling sensation of being truly seen, not as a patron or a titan, but as a specimen under a microscope. Her gaze was not hot with rage, it was arctic with a clarity that was far more terrifying. It was a look that stripped away his bespoke suit, his billion-dollar portfolio, and his carefully constructed aura of invincibility, leaving only the small, cruel man beneath. She turned her head slightly, her movement fluid and deliberate, and addressed the Japanese investor. The words that left her lips were not English. They were a cascade of pure, formal Japanese, each syllable perfectly formed, each intonation carrying the weight of centuries of tradition and honor. The language of the imperial court, of samurai oaths, of legal scrolls penned by masters. It was a sound so out of place in the mouth of a waitress that it was like hearing a nightingale begin to sing in the middle of a stock exchange floor. The investor's eyes, which had been politely glazed over by Blackwood's boorish monologue, widened in astonishment. He leaned forward, his back ramrod straight, his entire being now focused on Anya. He recognized the dialect immediately, the language of his own grandfather, a tongue of profound respect and nuance that he himself had not heard spoken with such flawless grace in years. She was apologizing for the interruption, for the breach of decorum, but the language she used elevated the apology into an act of profound courtesy that simultaneously and utterly excluded the monolingual American sitting between them, rendering him a clueless outsider at his own table. Then she turned back to Blackwood. The shift was seismic. Her face remained a calm, unreadable mask, but her voice, when she spoke again, was different. It was English, yes, but it was the English of a Columbia law scholar, precise, kitafela, and stripped of all deference. It was a scalpel. The words fell into the stunned silence of the restaurant with the chilling finality of a gavel strike. "That is not a contract, Mr. Blackwood." The statement hung in the air, simple, direct, and utterly devastating. It did not invite debate, it presented a fact. The smirk that had been plastered on Blackwood's face began to twitch, the muscles around his mouth unsure of what to do. Confusion warred with indignation in his eyes. He started to form a retort, a dismissive wave of his hand, but the sheer, unwavering certainty in her gaze stopped him cold. The entire room seemed to be leaning in, the quiet murmur of other conversations having died completely. The only sound was the faint, almost imperceptible hum of the ventilation system, a sound no one had ever noticed before this moment of absolute, suffocating silence. She leaned forward, not in a gesture of intimacy, but of examination, her eyes dropping to the elegant calligraphy spread across the table. Her voice remained low, yet it carried to every corner of the silent room, each word enunciated with the cold precision of a coroner reading a report. "It is a last will and testament." The phrase landed like a stone in a still pond, the ripples of its meaning spreading outwards, engulfing the table in a new layer of shock. Blackwood's face, which had been a mask of arrogant amusement, was now beginning to pale, a sickly, chalky color that clashed with his expensive tan. He stared at her, his mind, so quick to calculate market fluctuations and exploit legal loopholes, now struggling to process this impossible reality. A waitress. A nobody. She was dismantling his performance, his power play, with nothing more than a few quietly spoken words. He felt a tremor of something he hadn't felt since childhood, the fear of being exposed as a fraud. The Japanese investor, meanwhile, looked from Anya to the scroll and back again, a dawning understanding in his eyes. The pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place, and the picture they were forming was an ugly one. Her slender finger, unadorned and steady, pointed to a specific passage on the washi paper. She did not touch the document. Her finger hovered just above its surface, as if to avoid contaminating it. She read the line aloud, first in its original, poetic Japanese, her voice imbuing the words with a profound, melancholic beauty. Then, without missing a beat, she translated for Blackwood, her English words a stark, brutal contrast. "Our name is not a brand to be sold, but a legacy to be honored. It is the vessel that carries the integrity of our ancestors and the promise we make to our descendants." She paused, letting the weight of the sentiment, the very sentiment he had mocked as, quote, "poetic nonsense," settle over the table. "These are not the words of a business transaction. They are the words of a man entrusting his soul to the future." The quote was a direct repudiation of everything Blackwood stood for, a missile aimed directly at the hollow core of his materialistic universe. The artistry he had praised was, in fact, a sacred vow he had been desecrating with his greasy, ignorant fingerprints. The final pillars of Blackwood's composure crumbled as she delivered the next blow. She looked directly into his eyes, her own gaze unflinching, and the quiet professionalism of her tone was replaced by a low, simmering intensity that was almost a physical force. "It belonged to Kenji Tanaka." She said the name with a reverence that made it sound like a prayer and an accusation all at once. The name hung in the air between them, a ghost summoned from the past to bear witness. "My grandfather." The confession was a thunderclap in the silent room. The connection was made, the motive established. The entire narrative of the evening irrevocably changed. It was no longer a random act of defiance from an impertinent waitress. It was a granddaughter defending her family's honor. Blackwood's jaw went slack, a flicker of genuine primal fear flashing in his eyes as he finally understood the magnitude of the catastrophic miscalculation he had just made. He had not been mocking a random servant. He had been taunting the heir to the very legacy he had stolen. Her voice dropped even lower, becoming a near whisper, yet it was imbued with a chilling certainty that made it more powerful than any shout. "And I can tell you with absolute certainty that the signature is a forgery." She didn't need a forensic analysis or an expert opinion. She had something better, a lifetime of memories. My grandfather's hand, even after his first illness, was as steady as a surgeon's. Each stroke of his pen was a reflection of his spirit, balanced, strong, and filled with grace. Her eyes narrowed, focusing on the clumsy, ostentatious signature at the bottom of the will. "This," she said, her voice dripping with a contempt that mirrored his own from moments before, "is the work of a common thief. Desperate, crude. He would never, ever sign his name with such a dishonorable hand." The accusation was absolute, a final, unanswerable indictment that left no room for doubt or defense. In that moment, she had not only exposed his crime, but but she had also judged his character and found it utterly, irredeemably wanting. The spell of silence was shattered, not by a word, but by the scraping of a chair. The Japanese investor, Mr. Saito, stood up. His face, once a mask of polite neutrality, was now carved from granite. He gave Blackwood a look of such profound, unadulterated disgust that it seemed to physically wound the man. Without a single word, Saito placed his napkin neatly on the table, turned and walked away. It was the most eloquent and damning condemnation possible. The deal, worth hundreds of millions, had just evaporated into the perfumed air of the restaurant. Blackwood sat frozen, watching his prize, his victory, walk out the door, all because he couldn't resist the cheap thrill of humiliating a waitress. The blood began to return to his face, but it was not a healthy flush. It was a dark, mottled tide of pure, narcissistic rage. His universe, which had always bent to his will, had just been fractured by the one person in it he had considered less than nothing. He finally found his voice, and it was not the confident boom of a titan, but the venomous, strangled hiss of a cornered snake. "Manager!" The word tore through the quiet of the restaurant, ugly and sharp. He didn't shout, he commanded, his voice trembling with a fury so potent it was almost visible. He stabbed a finger in Anya's direction, his hand shaking. "Get this thing out of my sight." The dehumanizing word, thing, was all the eloquence his rage could muster. He was trying to reassert his dominance, to put her back in the box of insignificance he had created for her, but it was too late. The box was broken. Everyone in the room, from the busboys to the other patrons, had seen the truth. They had seen a king, naked and pathetic, being dethroned by a ghost who had decided to speak. The restaurant manager, a perpetually nervous man named Jean-Pierre, whose entire career was built on placating men like Blackwood, scurried to the table. His face was ashen, his hands fluttering uselessly at his sides. He saw the fury on Blackwood's face, the empty chair where the Japanese investor had been, and the impossible, calm defiance of his own waitress. His mind did a frantic, terrified calculation, and the result was depressingly predictable. He could not afford to anger Gideon Blackwood, a man who, as he was about to be reminded, held the fate of the restaurant in the palm of his hand. Jean-Pierre avoided looking at Anya, unable to meet the gaze of the woman who had just committed an act of unbelievable courage, an act for which he was about to punish her severely. His own cowardice was a bitter taste in the back of his throat, but his fear was stronger. Blackwood leaned in, his voice a low, menacing growl meant only for the manager. "This restaurant is in my building, Jean-Pierre. I own the ground beneath your feet. I can have this entire establishment shut down by morning for a health code violation that my people will be more than happy to invent." The threat was not subtle. It was a brutal, direct application of power, a reminder of the rules of the world they lived in. Money and influence were the only things that mattered, and he had an infinite supply of both. "This insolent liar has just cost me a 9-figure deal. She has publicly humiliated me. Now, you will fire her. You will do it now, and you will make sure she never works in this city again." His eyes were small and hard, glittering with malice. He didn't just want her gone. He wanted her erased. He wanted to destroy her life as completely as she had just destroyed his evening. Jean-Pierre's face crumpled. He turned to Anya, and for the first time, he looked at her, but his eyes were filled with a mixture of pity and terror. "Anya, you must leave. Please, collect your things. You are terminated." The words sounded clumsy and weak in the charged atmosphere, and pathetic whimper against the roar of what had just transpired. He was a puppet, and Blackwood was pulling the strings. Anya simply nodded. She felt no anger towards the manager, only a distant, clinical pity. He was just another cog in the machine, another soul who had traded his spine for a paycheck. The job, the uniform, the condescending patrons, it had all been a cage, and the door had just been flung wide open. Losing this job was not a punishment, it was a liberation. She had endured this gilded hell for her grandfather, but what she had done tonight, defending his name, was a far greater act of love than any paycheck could ever represent. Two security guards, their faces impassive, materialized at her side. They did not touch her, but their presence was a clear, unspoken command. As they escorted her towards the staff exit, a strange sense of calm washed over her. The walk across the marble floor was not a walk of shame. She held her head high, her back straight. She could feel the eyes of every person in the restaurant on her, but for the first time she did not feel their judgment. She felt their stunned silence, their reluctant admiration. She was no longer the invisible waitress. She was the woman who had spoken truth to power, the woman who had made Gideon Blackwood bleed. As she passed his table, she allowed herself one last look. He was still sitting there, alone amidst the wreckage of his dinner, his face a mask of impotent fury. The beautiful, forged will still lay on the table, an elegant monument to his greed and his stupidity. The heavy kitchen doors swung shut behind her, cutting off the opulent silence of the dining room and replacing it with the clatter of pans and the shouts of the chefs. The transition was jarring. She was led through the bustling, steamy heart of the restaurant, a world of sweat and hard work that was a universe away from the curated perfection out front. She was taken to the small, cramped locker room, where she methodically removed the black uniform that had been her skin for the past year. As she folded it for the last time, she felt as if she were shedding a costume, stepping out of a role she had been forced to play. Beneath it, she was still Anya Tanaka, the top of her class at Columbia Law, the granddaughter of Kenji Tanaka. She was a warrior who had simply been in disguise. She put on her own simple clothes, grabbed her worn backpack, and walked out the back door without a word. The cold night air of the grimy service alley hit her like a slap in the face, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled perfection of Elysian. The smell of garbage and stale grease hung heavy in the air. For a long moment, she just stood there, leaning against the cold brick wall, the adrenaline that had sustained her finally beginning to ebb away. And in its place, a wave of cold, terrifying panic began to rise. $15,000. That was the number that governed her life. $15,000 a month. For the nursing home, for the doctors, for the machines that kept her grandfather comfortable and alive. She had just thrown away her only means of paying for it. The weight of that reality pressed down on her, a physical force that made it hard to breathe. Had her moment of righteous fury been an act of selfish pride? Had she just sacrificed her grandfather's well-being for a fleeting taste of vengeance? The doubt was a poison seeping into the cracks of her newfound resolve. She began to walk, her footsteps echoing in the empty downtown streets. The towering skyscrapers of Manhattan, usually a source of awe and inspiration, now seemed to mock her, their glittering lights representing a world of wealth and power she was utterly locked out of. Each window was a reminder of the life she was supposed to have, the career she had abandoned. She replayed the scene in her mind, over and over. The contempt in Blackwood's eyes, the weight of the water pitcher, the sound of her own voice, speaking a language of honor he could never comprehend, the look of shock on his face. The satisfaction was still there, a warm ember in her chest, but it was now surrounded by the cold, creeping dread of consequence. She was alone, jobless, and facing an impossible financial burden. The system was designed to protect men like Blackwood and crush people like her. What chance did she really have? She found herself in a small, deserted park, a tiny patch of green amidst the concrete and steel. She sank onto a cold iron bench, the weight of her despair finally becoming too much to bear. She buried her face in her hands, the rough texture of her palms a grounding sensation. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the full, crushing weight of her loss. The loss of her career, the loss of her family's fortune, the loss of her grandfather's vibrant mind. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It felt like the entire world was aligned against her, a vast, indifferent machine designed to grind the powerless into dust. The fight seemed impossible, the enemy insurmountable. Perhaps the most rational thing to do was to simply give up, to find another menial job, to swallow her pride, and continue the slow, painful work of just surviving. But then another image pushed its way through the fog of her despair, the image of the will, the elegant, flowing characters of her grandfather's language, twisted to serve a thief's purpose, the clumsy, arrogant forgery of his name. It was not just a financial crime. It was a deep, personal violation. It was an attack on his very soul. Blackwood hadn't just stolen a company. He had tried to steal a man's legacy, to rewrite his final words to suit his own greed. The thought of that beautiful document, a testament to a life lived with honor, being used as a cheap trophy to impress an investor, sent a fresh surge of anger through her, an anger so pure and so cold that it burned away all her fear and doubt. This was no longer just about the money. This was about justice. It was about reclaiming a stolen history. Her legal mind, which had been dulled by months of calculating tips and memorizing wine pairings, suddenly sparked back to life, whirring with an energy it hadn't felt in years. She began to dissect the situation, not as a desperate, unemployed waitress, but as the brilliant legal strategist she was trained to be. The forged will was not just an insult, it was a tangible piece of evidence. Forgery of a legal document, especially one tied to assets and intellectual property, was a serious federal crime. It was proof of criminal intent. It suggested that the hostile takeover of Tanaka Innovations wasn't just ruthless business, it was likely predicated on fraud from the very beginning. Blackwood's arrogance, his need to show off his trophy, had been his fatal mistake. He had handed her the very weapon she needed to destroy him. A new kind of calm settled over her, a cold, focused determination that was more powerful than any fleeting emotion. Her path was suddenly clear. She would not be a victim. She would not be a ghost. She would be a prosecutor. She would take the fight to Gideon Blackwood, not in a restaurant, but in a courtroom. She would dismantle his empire, piece by piece, using the very system of law he had so expertly twisted for his own gain. The grief for her grandfather was still there, a constant ache in her heart, but it was no longer a weight holding her down. It was fuel. It was the fire in the forge, and she was about to hammer it into a sword. The battle would be long and difficult, but for the first time since her world had fallen apart, she felt not despair, but a profound and exhilarating sense of purpose. She pulled out her old, cracked smartphone, its screen, a spiderweb of fractures that mirrored the state of her life until this very moment. Her fingers, which had been trembling with panic just minutes before, were now perfectly steady. She scrolled through a list of contacts she hadn't looked at in over a year, names from a past life that felt like a distant dream. Law professors, fellow students, legal aid contacts. Her eyes scanned the list until they landed on one name, a name that represented academic brilliance, unwavering integrity, and a deep, paternal kindness she desperately needed right now. Professor Alistair Finch. He had been her mentor at Columbia, the one who had told her she had one of the sharpest legal minds he had ever encountered. He was a titan in the world of corporate law and legal ethics, a man who feared no one. Taking a deep, steadying breath that seemed to draw in all the cold night air, she pressed the call button. The phone rang 4 times, each ring stretching into an eternity. She almost hung up, her nerve faltering for a split second. Then, a voice answered, gravelly with sleep, but instantly recognizable. Finch? It wasn't a question, but a statement. Anya's heart hammered against her ribs. Professor Finch, she began, her own voice sounding foreign to her ears, a ghost from her past. It's Anya Tanaka. I'm sorry to call so late. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and she could hear the sound of shuffling, of a lamp being switched on. Anya? The professor's voice was sharp with surprise, then softened with genuine concern. My goodness, I haven't heard from you in ages. Is everything all right? The simple human kindness in his voice almost broke her resolve, but she held it together, the mission paramount. No, sir, she said, her voice gaining strength, but I believe I have a case you'll find very interesting. She spent the next 10 minutes laying out the entire story, her voice a low, steady monotone. She was careful to present the facts objectively, stripping away the raw emotion of the encounter and focusing on the legal implications. The document, the context, the admission of its purpose, and the clear evidence of forgery she had witnessed with her own eyes. She described the scroll, Blackwood's exact words, the investor's presence, everything. She was no longer a granddaughter seeking vengeance. She was a lawyer presenting a case, building a foundation of facts that was solid and unshakable. She knew that for a man like Finch, the evidence was everything, and she was determined to give him a case so compelling he could not possibly ignore it. She was offering him the chance to take on the kind of corporate dragon he had spent his entire career teaching his students how to slay. When she finished, there was a long, profound silence on the other end of the line. She could hear the faint sound of his breathing, the ticking of a clock in the background. For a terrifying moment, she thought he was going to dismiss her, to tell her she was in over her head, that she had no proof, that she was a fool to challenge a man like Gideon Blackwood. But when he finally spoke, his voice was not dismissive. It was a low, dangerous growl, the sound of a sleeping lion that had just been prodded with a stick. "That man," Professor Finch said, his voice vibrating with a cold intellectual fury, "is not just a predator. He's a ghoul. He has crossed a line that separates ruthless business from profane criminality." He paused again, and Anya could almost hear the gears of his formidable mind turning. "Meet me in my office at Columbia, 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. And Anya, don't speak to another living soul about this. We are going to bury him." The next morning, Anya walked through the wrought iron gates of Columbia University, a place she had once called home. The familiar Gothic architecture, the scent of old books and autumn leaves, the bustling energy of students hurrying to class, it was all a painful reminder of the life she had lost. But today, she did not feel like an outsider. She walked with a newfound purpose, her steps sure and steady. She was no longer a ghost haunting the fringes of society. She was a combatant returning to her training ground. Professor Finch's office was exactly as she remembered it. A chaotic, comforting sanctuary of towering bookshelves, overflowing stacks of legal briefs, and the faint, pleasant smell of pipe tobacco and old paper. It was the war room where her counterattack would be planned, a fortress of knowledge and law that stood in stark opposition to Blackwood's sterile, opulent world of glass and steel. Professor Finch, a bear of a man with a wild mane of white hair and eyes that twinkled with fierce intelligence, greeted her not with pity but with respect. He poured her a cup of strong black coffee and listened, without interruption, as she recounted the story again, this time filling in the emotional details, the history of her family, the slow, painful decline of her grandfather. He listened with the patience of a priest and the analytical mind of a master strategist. When she was finished, he stood up and began to pace the length of his office, his hands clasped behind his back. "His arrogance will be his undoing," Finch declared, his voice booming in the quiet room. "He showed you the murder weapon because he was so convinced you were less than human, that you were incapable of recognizing it. That is the kind of hubris that so perfectly defines a sociopath." Finch's office was not just a room, it was the physical manifestation of a life dedicated to the law. The air itself felt thick with precedent and theory. The scent of old leather bindings and aging paper, a comforting perfume of intellectual rigor. For Anya, stepping back into this world was like taking her first full breath after nearly drowning. She watched the professor pace, his large frame a whirlwind of righteous energy, and felt the last vestiges of her victimhood sloughing off like a dead skin. Here, surrounded by the codified wisdom of centuries, she was not a disgraced waitress. She was an instrument of justice, being honed and sharpened for the battle to come. The first, most critical challenge was tactical. The forged will was no longer in her possession. It was a ghost, a memory, a piece of evidence that was now, presumably, locked away in one of Gideon Blackwood's vaults, or, more likely, reduced to ashes in a high-powered incinerator. "He holds the primary evidence," Finch stated, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "And he knows you saw it. He will never let that document see the light of day again." A formal legal request would be met with denials, delays, and a legion of his corporate lawyers who would bury us in motions until the sun burns out. He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes intense. "We cannot attack him through conventional channels. It would be like a rowboat attacking a battleship. We need a different kind of weapon. We need a witness. Someone whose credibility is unimpeachable. Someone who was there, who saw the document, who heard his confession." The answer was obvious, hanging in the air between them, as fragile and as potentially powerful as a spider's thread. The Japanese investor, Mr. Saito. A man whose reputation for honor and integrity was legendary in international finance. A man whose word alone could shake the foundations of Blackwood's empire. The task of reaching out to him fell to Anya, and it was a challenge steeped in nuance and cultural respect. A cold email or a desperate phone call would be dismissed as the ravings of a disgruntled employee. Her approach had to be a reflection of the very values Blackwood had desecrated. She spent an entire day in the Columbia Library, not in the law section, but in the East Asian collection, surrounded by texts on classical Japanese etiquette and formal correspondence. With Professor Finch's guidance on the legal framework, she began to draft a letter. It was not a plea for help, nor was it an accusation. It was a carefully constructed masterpiece of formal Japanese, a language she wielded with the precision of a master calligrapher. Every character was chosen for its specific weight and connotation, every phrase a delicate balance of profound respect for Mr. Saito and a clear, dignified statement of her own identity as Kenji Tanaka's granddaughter. She wrote of honor, not of crime. She spoke of legacy, not of theft. She described the deep shame she felt, not for her own circumstances, but that a man of Mr. Saito's stature had been subjected to such a dishonorable display. She did not ask him to be her witness. She simply stated the truth of her connection to the scroll and expressed her solemn duty to protect her grandfather's name from the falsehood that had been presented. She concluded the letter by invoking a famous Japanese proverb about a single candle being able to illuminate a room that has been dark for 1,000 years, subtly positioning him as a potential source of that light. She sent the email through a secure, encrypted service Finch provided, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. Everything hinged on the character of a man she had met for only a few fleeting moments, a man who had every reason to ignore her and avoid the messy entanglement of a corporate war. 3 days passed in an agony of silence. Anya threw herself into the preliminary research, spending hours hunched over a laptop in Finch's office, digging into the public records of Blackwood Capital's acquisition of Tanaka Innovations. It was a labyrinth of shell corporations, offshore holding companies, and convoluted legal jargon designed to obscure and confuse. It was a fortress of paper, and she was searching for a single crack. The silence from Tokyo was a constant, gnawing distraction. With each passing hour, her hope dwindled, replaced by the cold fear that she had been too subtle, that Mr. Saito had dismissed her as a crank, or worse, that he had forwarded her letter directly to Blackwood's lawyers. She was on the verge of despair when, late on the 3rd night, an email notification chimed on her phone. The sender's address was a simple, elegant string of characters. It was from Mr. Saito. The email was short and just as formally polite as her own. He expressed his deepest condolences for her grandfather's condition and his profound respect for the legacy of Tanaka Innovations. He confirmed that the events in the restaurant had transpired exactly as she remembered, and that he had been deeply disturbed by Mr. Blackwood's conduct. Then came the critical part. He wrote that while he could not interfere directly at this stage, his own sense of honor compelled him to offer what assistance he could. He explained that during the dinner when Blackwood had been pontificating to the maitre d', he had, on instinct, taken a high-resolution photograph of the document with his phone, intending to study the calligraphy later. He had captured the entire scroll, from the first character to the forged signature, in perfect, damning detail. Attached to the email was a single, large image file. Anya's hands trembled as she clicked to open it. There it was. Projected on the large monitor in Finch's office, the document glowed with an almost ethereal light. The elegant, flowing script of her grandfather's will, the words about honor and legacy that were seared into her soul. And at the bottom, the clumsy, arrogant scrawl of the forged signature. It was more than a photograph. It was a digital ghost, an incorruptible copy of the crime itself. Professor Finch, looking over her shoulder, let out a low whistle of admiration. "The man is a samurai," he murmured, his respect for Saito evident. "He gave us the murder weapon without ever touching it." The photograph was their first concrete piece of evidence, a foundation upon which they could build their entire case. The sense of relief that washed over Anya was so profound it almost brought her to her knees. For the first time, she was not just fighting a memory. She was armed with proof. Finch immediately sent the encrypted image file to a trusted colleague, a woman named Dr. Elena Petrova, one of the world's foremost forensic document examiners. Petrova was a legend, a woman who could coax confessions from ink and paper, who saw the hidden stories in the pressure of a pen stroke and the microscopic fibers of a page. 2 days later, her report arrived. It was a 20-page document filled with high-magnification comparisons, spectrographic analysis, and dense technical explanations. But its conclusion was stated in simple, brutal language. The signature on the document was, without any doubt, a forgery. Petrova's report detailed how the ink saturation was inconsistent with a traditional calligraphy brush, suggesting a modern pen had been used to crudely imitate the style. She identified hesitation marks, microscopic pauses in the stroke, that were absent in the genuine examples of Kenji Tanaka's signature that Anya had provided from old family letters. The report concluded that the forgery was the work of an arrogant amateur, someone who understood the shape of the characters but had no grasp of the soul behind them. With the forgery now a matter of forensic certainty, the true hunt began. Anya and Finch transformed the professor's office into a full-fledged investigation headquarters. They papered one entire wall with a complex flowchart mapping out the corporate structure of Blackwood Capital and its web of subsidiaries. They spent their days filing Freedom of Information Act requests and their nights sifting through terabytes of archived financial data, SEC filings, and obscure international business registries. It was a grueling, soul-crushing process. For every promising lead, they would hit a dozen dead ends. Blackwood's lawyers had constructed a legal fortress that was seemingly impenetrable, a maze of legal entities designed to make tracing the true ownership and flow of money a Herculean task. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking, and there were moments when Anya felt like she was trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. During these moments of doubt, when the endless columns of numbers and legalese began to blur into an insurmountable wall of text, she would visit her grandfather. She would sit by his bedside in the quiet, sterile nursing home, holding his frail, unresponsive hand. The rhythmic beep of the monitors was a constant, painful reminder of what was at stake. She would read to him from his favorite books of Japanese poetry, her voice soft but steady. She would tell him about her progress, about Professor Finch, about the small victories and the frustrating setbacks. Though he could not reply, she felt his presence, his unwavering spirit, and it was in those quiet moments that her resolve would harden anew. She was not just fighting for a company or for money. She was fighting for the silent man in the bed, for the titan he once was, and for the simple, profound justice of his name being cleared of a forger's stain. The breakthrough came not from a complex financial algorithm, but from a dusty, forgotten corner of the United States Patent and Trademark Office's online archives. Anya had been pursuing a hunch, a nagging feeling that the core of the fraud had to be linked to the foundational technology that made Tanaka Innovations so valuable, a revolutionary patent for a new type of semiconductor architecture. After days of navigating a clunky, outdated government database, she finally found it, the original patent transfer agreement. It was a scanned document, the image quality grainy, but the details were clear. It transferred sole ownership of patents 7, 432, 158 from Tanaka Innovations to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands named Argent Solutions, a company she had already traced back to Gideon Blackwood. The document was dated October 14th, 3 years prior, a full 2 weeks before Blackwood Capital had even announced its hostile takeover bid. Anya's blood ran cold as she stared at the date. She knew that date. It was seared into her memory with the trauma of a branding iron. She frantically pulled up her old digital calendar, her fingers flying across the keyboard. There it was, October 14th, the day her grandfather had collapsed in his office from a transient ischemic attack, a minor stroke that had been the first warning sign of the larger one to come. He had been rushed to the hospital. He was unconscious and in the ICU for 48 hours. He could not have signed anything. He was physically, medically incapable of holding a pen, let alone signing away the crown jewel of his life's work. She zoomed in on the signature at the bottom of the patent transfer. It was different from the one on the will, more practiced, more confident, but it was still a forgery. A cold, calculated act of theft committed while her grandfather lay helpless in a hospital bed. This was the original sin. This was the linchpin of the entire conspiracy. The forged will had been an act of post-mortem greed, an attempt to mop up any remaining assets. But this fraudulent patent transfer was the foundational crime. By secretly gaining control of the company's most valuable asset, Blackwood had been able to systematically devalue the company's stock price, creating the perfect conditions for his lowball hostile takeover. He hadn't just ruthlessly outmaneuvered his opponent in the boardroom, he had cheated, lied, and committed a felony before the battle had even officially begun. It was a pattern of behavior, a clear and undeniable trail of criminal fraud. Anya printed the document, her hands steady, a cold, triumphant fire burning in her chest. She finally had him. She had the root of the crime, not just the ugly flower that had bloomed from it. While Anya and Finch were unearthing his past crimes, Gideon Blackwood was not idle. The public humiliation at Elysian had rattled him more than he would ever admit. He was a man who controlled narratives, and for one evening he had lost control completely. He had a security team run a deep background check on Anya, and when he learned she was not just some random waitress, but a former Columbia law prodigy and Kenji Tanaka's granddaughter, a cold dread began to settle in his stomach. He was not afraid of the law. He had been buying his way out of legal trouble his entire life. He was afraid of the story. He was afraid of a smart, motivated, and deeply wronged opponent who had nothing left to lose. He began quietly moving assets, liquidating funds through a series of complex international transfers, and ordering his legal team to deep six any and all documents related to the Tanaka acquisition. He was trying to erase the past, to shred the evidence of his crimes, unaware that the most crucial pieces were already in his enemy's hands. The final piece of the puzzle was the plan of attack. Finch, Anya, and a small, trusted team of his former graduate students, who had been sworn to secrecy, gathered in the professor's office. The room, now covered in evidence maps, timelines, and corporate charts, had become the command center for their war. Finch laid out the options. They could go to the SEC, to the Department of Justice. They had more than enough evidence to trigger a massive federal investigation. But that would be a long, slow war of attrition, Finch argued, his voice grim. Blackwood would tie us up in court for a decade. He would use his fortune to exhaust our resources, to appeal every decision, to bury us in paperwork until justice dies of old age. We have the evidence to win the war, but he has the resources to make sure the final battle is never fought. He looked directly at Anya, his eyes gleaming. We cannot give him that chance. We need to strike a blow that is so public, so sudden, and so devastating that he cannot recover. We need to prosecute him not in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. The stage for this public execution was already set. Blackwood Capital's annual shareholder meeting, scheduled to take place in 3 weeks at the Grand Ballroom of the New York Hilton. It was Blackwood's yearly coronation, a carefully stage-managed event where he would boast about his firm's profits and vision to an audience of investors, analysts, and the most influential members of the financial press. It was his temple of power, the one place on earth where he felt completely untouchable. Using his extensive network of contacts, Professor Finch secured a single, unassuming proxy pass for a small, independent shareholder, an elderly widow who was more than happy to lend her vote to his cause. The pass was in a simple white envelope, and when Finch handed it to Anya, it felt heavier than a block of gold. It was her key to the enemy's fortress. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Anya would attend the meeting, not as a protester or a heckler, but as a legitimate shareholder representative. She would wait for the open question-and-answer session at the end of Blackwood's keynote address. And then, when all the cameras were rolling and the entire financial world was watching, she would walk to the microphone. She would not shout. She would not accuse. She would calmly, methodically, and with the full weight of irrefutable evidence, present her case. She would project the image of the forged patent transfer next to her grandfather's hospital records. She would show the forensic analysis of the will's signature. She would tell the story of Kenji Tanaka, not as a failed businessman, but as a victim of a sophisticated, predatory fraud. She would dismantle Gideon Blackwood's reputation with the one thing his money could not buy, the truth. The final days leading up to the meeting were a blur of intense preparation. Anya rehearsed her presentation relentlessly, honing every word, every phrase, until it was a polished, unbreakable weapon. She memorized every date, every figure, every legal statute. She was no longer fueled by rage or grief. She was powered by a cold, righteous certainty. She was not just seeking vengeance for her family. She was fighting for a principle, for the idea that the law should be a shield for the innocent, not a sword for the powerful. On the morning of the meeting, she stood before the mirror in her small apartment. She was not wearing a waitress uniform or the simple clothes of a student. She was dressed in a simple, elegant, dark gray suit, a quiet armor for the battle to come. Her face was calm, her eyes clear. The ghost of Elysian was gone forever. In her place stood Anya Tanaka, prosecutor, judge, and jury, ready to walk into the lion's den and deliver a verdict that would echo from Wall Street to Tokyo. The Grand Ballroom of the New York Hilton was a universe unto itself, a self-contained cosmos of power and capital. The air was thick with the scent of expensive coffee and the collective, self-satisfied hum of the financial elite. Light from a dozen enormous modern chandeliers glinted off $1,000 watches, polished cufflinks, and the rims of water glasses that were never allowed to be less than half full. On a massive stage, flanked by screens the size of small buildings projecting the stoic, upward-trending logo of Blackwood Capital, Gideon Blackwood himself was holding court. He stood at a sleek, minimalist lectern, a master of his domain, his voice amplified to the level of a demigod's pronouncement. He spoke of integrity, of vision, of a future built on ethical growth, and the audience of shareholders, analysts, and fawning journalists hung on every hollow word, their polite applause, a rhythmic, predictable tide. Into this cathedral of manufactured virtue, Anya Tanaka walked. She was a single, quiet note of discord in a symphony of complicity. Her dark gray suit was an armor of anonymity, allowing her to glide through the crowd unnoticed. Her proxy pass clutched in a hand that did not tremble. She found a seat near the back, her heart a slow, powerful drum against her ribs, its rhythm a countdown to the execution she was about to perform. The speech concluded with a crescendo of meaningless corporate platitudes, and the room erupted in the obligatory standing ovation. Blackwood bathed in the applause, a small, smug smile playing on his lips as he raised a hand to quiet the adoring masses. He looked out at the sea of faces, seeing not people but prophets, assets, and acolytes. He felt invincible, immortal, a king upon his throne. The Q&A session began. a carefully curated piece of theater. The first few questions were softballs, lobbed from friendly journalists. Inquiries about projected earnings and market expansion that allowed Blackwood to further pontificate and display his supposed genius. Anya watched, her patience absolute, her timing being calculated with the precision of a sniper. She waited for the perfect lull, the moment when the room's energy was at its most complacent. Then, she stood. Her movement was not sudden or dramatic, but it was definitive. She began the long walk down the center aisle towards the single microphone stand designated for audience questions. The journey felt both like an eternity and an instant. The plush red carpet seemed to try and swallow her shoes, the low murmur of the crowd a distant buzz. She could feel a few curious eyes turned towards her, this unknown woman who did not have the familiar face of a Wall Street analyst. She did not look at them. Her gaze was fixed on the man on the stage, the architect of her family's pain, who had not yet noticed the ghost of his past walking toward him. She reached the microphone, its cool metal, a grounding presence beneath her steady hand. She adjusted its height, the small squeak of the mechanism echoing slightly in the vast room. It was only then that Blackwood's eyes, scanning the crowd for his next sycophant, finally landed on her. For a fraction of a second, there was nothing but blank non-recognition. He saw a suit, a woman, a shareholder. But then, as the stage lights caught the angles of her face, a flicker of something else crossed his features. A shadow of memory, of a dimly lit restaurant, of a profound and shocking humiliation. His smile tightened, a barely perceptible twitch at the corner of his mouth. The air in the room shifted, the complacent hum replaced by a sharp, inquisitive silence. Everyone could feel it. This was not going to be a question about fourth-quarter earnings. Anya took a slow, deliberate breath, drawing in the stale, climate-controlled air of his kingdom. Then she spoke, and her voice, calm, clear, and amplified to fill every corner of the ballroom, was the sound of a guillotine blade being released. "My name is Anya Tanaka." The name fell into the silence, and on the stage, Gideon Blackwood froze, the color draining from his face as if a plug had been pulled. The ghost had a name, and she had come to his temple to claim her pound of flesh. "I am the granddaughter of Kenji Tanaka," she continued, her voice unwavering, each word a perfectly placed stone building the foundation of his ruin. "The founder of Tanaka Innovations, a company you acquired 3 years ago under what you presented to the SEC as a legitimate hostile takeover." A frantic whispering erupted in the audience. On the stage, Blackwood seemed to shrink, his hands gripping the sides of the lectern as if to hold himself upright. He made a subtle gesture to a security guard near the stage, but it was too late. All eyes, all cameras, were locked on Anya. "You spoke earlier of integrity," she said, her voice laced with an icy contempt. "So I would like to ask you about the integrity of this document." As she spoke, the massive screen behind Blackwood, which a moment ago had displayed his company's soaring stock price, flickered. In its place appeared a high-resolution image of the patent transfer agreement, the one that had stolen the soul of her grandfather's company while he lay unconscious in a hospital bed. Beside it, she projected the hospital's admission record, the date and time a stark, damning timestamp. "Can you explain to the shareholders how my grandfather managed to sign away his life's work from an ICU bed, while he was medically documented as being incapacitated?" The collective gasp from the audience was a physical thing, a wave of shock that washed over the room. The frantic clicking of 100 cameras was the only sound that followed. Before Blackwood could even form a syllable, before his mind could construct a lie big enough to cover this gaping wound, Anya twisted the knife. Perhaps his signature was acquired through the same honorable methods you used to acquire his will. The screen changed again. Now it displayed the 2 images that would become the emblem of his downfall, broadcast on every news channel by nightfall. On one side, a crisp, high-resolution photograph of the forged will, courtesy of Mr. Saito. On the other, a sample of Kenji Tanaka's true, elegant signature from an old letter, According to a world-renowned forensic expert, the signature on the will you possessed is, and I quote, the work of an arrogant amateur. She paused, letting the expert's words hang in the air like a death sentence. A crude forgery, Mr. Blackwood, just like the one you used to steal his patent. Your entire empire, the one you built your reputation on, is founded on a series of common, pathetic forgeries. You are not a titan of industry. You are a common thief who preys on the sick and the dying. She let go of the microphone, her work done. The statement was absolute, the evidence irrefutable, her judgment final. The ballroom descended into utter chaos. The polite facade of the corporate world was ripped away, revealing the raw, ugly reality beneath. Shareholders were on their feet, shouting, their faces masks of fury and betrayal. Journalists scrambled over chairs, yelling questions, their cameras flashing like strobe lights, capturing every angle of Gideon Blackwood's spectacular implosion. On the stage, the man who had commanded this room with absolute authority just minutes before was now a trapped animal. His face was a ghastly shade of white, slick with sweat under the hot stage lights. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, croaking sound came out. His eyes darted back and forth, from the damning evidence on the screen to the furious faces in the crowd, finding no escape, no ally, no exit. His entire life, his carefully constructed reality of power and impunity, had been dismantled in less than 2 minutes by a woman he had once dismissed as a thing. He stumbled backward from the lectern, his legs unsteady, the image of a fallen king, stripped of his crown and his lies in the full glare of the world's judgment. His ruin was total, public, and exquisitely complete. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Anya Tanaka finally exposed the truth. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was a corporate tsunami. The SEC launched a sweeping investigation that unearthed a decade of fraud and manipulation. Blackwood Capital collapsed into insolvency, its assets frozen, its name becoming a byword for corporate criminality. Gideon Blackwood himself was indicted on multiple federal charges, his future now a bleak landscape of courtrooms, depositions, and the very real prospect of spending the rest of his life in a federal prison, a world where his money meant nothing. But Anya was far away from the noise and the wreckage. 2 weeks after the shareholder meeting, she received a personal call from Mr. Saito. He spoke of his profound admiration for her courage and her unwavering commitment to honor, a quality he lamented was so rare in their world. He didn't just offer his testimony, he offered her a future. He was launching a new division in his global firm, headquartered in Tokyo, dedicated to corporate ethics and responsible investment, and he wanted her to lead it. It was a chance not just to reclaim her career, but to redefine it, to use her skills not for predation, but for protection. Anya accepted. 6 months later, she stood on the balcony of her new apartment in Shinjuku, looking out at the glittering, endless cityscape of Tokyo. Below, the world moved with a vibrant, orderly energy that soothed her soul. She was now a senior executive at one of the most respected firms in the world, her days spent analyzing companies not just for their profitability, but for their character. She had used her first substantial paycheck to move her grandfather to a state-of-the-art care facility in Japan, where he was surrounded by the sounds and language of his homeland. She visited him every day, reading to him, telling him about her work, about how she was using the principles he had taught her to build a new legacy for their name, one founded not on stolen patents, but on unshakable integrity. He remained silent, but sometimes, when she spoke of honor, she was sure she could feel a faint, responsive pressure in the hand she held in hers. Her journey had been forged in the fires of loss and humiliation, but she had emerged, not scarred, but tempered, a sword made stronger in the breaking. She had found her voice in a silent restaurant, and now she was using it to change the world. If Anya Tanaka's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.